You are listening to Off the Shelf, a podcast by The Conference Board.
Are we losing our mind several times a day? Hello, my name is Nabil Ahmed, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Off the Shelf, a book discussion series brought to you by The Conference Board. In this episode, I'll be sitting down with Vikram Mansharamani to discuss his latest book, Think for Yourself, Restoring Common Sense in an Age of Experts in Artificial Intelligence, where we'll talk about my question that I opened up with, as well as a variety of other things. So to start out with the book Think for Yourself, it's really a summary of four parts. And one of the things that I really liked about it, Vikram, was it was packed with great stories. I could feel your good sense of humor coming through. And there are really four parts to it. The first part, which is you were sort of discovering how and why we got here and what you called losing control. And then the second part was talking about some of the ramifications of what happens when we've lost control or are losing control. The third part is talking about how to reclaim our autonomy. And then the last, where you close up the book, is talking about this path forward. But maybe to take a step back, the quote that I began with, or that question, which was how you opened up your book, which was around, you may not realize it, but you've lost your mind. And we all have. And I was like, oh, okay. So this was interesting to me. And you start to make that argument that, in fact, we lose our minds all the time, often several times a day. I'd be curious if you could just elaborate on that.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks, Nabil, for having me. I'm thrilled to be with you on this podcast and to share some of my thoughts. So, and thank you to the Conference Board for having me as well. Look, the argument I make is that we have all been drowning in information. There's more data than we can handle. And the result is we're being asked to make more decisions than we ever have. There's choices around every corner. Because of that, a lot of us have assumed, we've come to believe that there is an optimal or a perfect decision for virtually every choice we make. We also realize that we don't have the skills, know-how, or knowledge to make the perfect decision in every walk of life. So what do? We turn to technologies and experts that promise us the salvation, if you will, from this fear of missing out on the perfect selection. The result is we start outsourcing our thinking. We stop thinking. We give up control of our thoughts and we let others give us opinions, and we basically lose our minds. So that's where the phrase comes from that I started. That's the logic I have behind it. And as you alluded to, there are huge implications of that very process.
Very nice. Thank you for that. Very, very interesting. A couple of examples that came through and that I'd like to touch upon that I think are very relevant still today is, and I think we've all heard this one, the GPS routes. People sort of blindly follow those. You had a couple of examples where you touched upon that. And I remember recently, there was somewhere in Italy, this was probably in the last week or so, where there was a small Italian town where everybody was following GPS routes, but it took them off of essentially a hill that goes down 45 degrees. And it got so bad within the town that the town actually put up a sign that says, do not follow Google Maps. And so, I find it interesting where it almost seems like we're in this sort of very interesting, I don't want to say backwards type society where we're having to tell people to stop to look at what they are outsourcing to their computers or someone who's not there, instead of looking at what is right in front of them. Is that a safe way to summarize it?
That's very interesting. It's a great description, Nabil. Part of the reason I titled the book Think for Yourself is the image it conjures for me is a parent, obviously not in a violent way, but smacking a child on the head in a very loving way, because we want to be politically correct and not hurt our children. But letting the child know, think for yourself, like stop listening to what other people are telling you to do and actually think for yourself. And so the logic that you describe with the GPS is exactly that. We literally get in a car and stop thinking, blindly following. So there's that example, of course, in the Italian town that you referred to, but there's plenty of other examples, even from within the domain of GPS stories, right? So one story that is one of my personal favorites is, and this was through Apple Maps. At one point, if you were in Alaska, I think it was in Fairbanks, Alaska, and you typed in Fairbanks Airport, the routing that Apple Maps took you to the airport actually went over the active runways to get to the terminal. And there were plenty of people that passed signs that said, stop, active runway, caution, no civilian cars. And they drove right by these signs around gates and went onto an active runway. That sort of captures the essence of not thinking. Another fun story I have in the book, again, from the GPS domain is, a bus driver that was driving a bus, including a bunch of students from, I think it was a softball game. And there are all these signs as the bus driver is approaching an underpass, and the signs say, caution, this is the height. The bus is taller than that height. And the bus driver just passed all these caution signs, looked, and drove the bus right into the bottom of a bridge that was an overpass. Frankly, very dangerous, almost resulted in some serious injuries. Fortunately, no one got seriously hurt. But when you read the story about that event, you find that the bus driver concluded, actually, I didn't have to think about it because the GPS had a setting that said bus. So I assumed it knew my height of the bus. I assumed it knew the underpasses, and I assumed it was all correct. So why do I need to pay attention to any signs? So there's another example of just literally shutting off the brain to blindly follow what's being given to us by a technology.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that. And kind of maybe taking that same example, but maybe applying it instead from an individual to more like a organizational kind of systemic perspective, is that you had a really interesting example with Ebola and the CDC. And you probably know where I'm going with this, is that sadly, we're seeing a very similar parallel. And, with today with COVID-19. And, a lot of this, I think, started out with some of those cruise ships that were docked, where there was a lot of cases that came on. And your point that I believe that I got through it was people were more just following the rules instead of, again, like the common sense of, should we really let this patient go here? Well, they have a high fever, but it's below this certain threshold that we've identified. So then let's just unleash them into society, and then the outbreak continues. Could you talk about like how you have seen what you wrote with that Ebola and CDC with parallels, or maybe what may be different from what's been happening the past several months with COVID-19?
Sure. It's a great question, Nabil. So let's take a step back for a minute before we go there. And let me just set the context of what I mean by sort of outsourcing your thinking. So basically, we have come to outsource our thinking to what I call expertise. And expertise can be embodied in numerous forms. Of course, it can be embodied in the form of a human, someone we call an expert or a specialist. It can be embodied in the form of a technology or an algorithm. And that, of course, we sometimes think of as artificial intelligence or other algorithms. But it can also be embodied in the form of a checklist or rules or protocols. And really what you're hinting at here is that third category, where what we've done is designed a system that is intended to minimize variation and maximize control of that expertise deployed remotely through the form of checklists. So we can't keep track of the example used in the book. We can't keep track of every person who might have been exposed to particular diseases, but we can have checklists that medical professionals can use to say, hey, has this person crossed this threshold? Has something happened? Therefore, we know there's a concern. And the example I use in the book was one of America's Ebola patients in Texas. The nurses that had tended to him were definitively exposed. We knew that. One of them, in fact, contracted the disease Ebola at the time, and the other one was cleared to travel on commercial air travel, exposing herself to hundreds of other people going through airports and on the plane, etc., and was allowed to do so despite having a fever. Now, that's the interesting part, because the fever didn't cross the threshold. And so that second nurse, who we know was a confirmed exposure to Ebola at the time, had treated an Ebola patient, had a fever, and yet was still cleared by a CDC professional to get on a plane. So that's sort of the not thinking, right? Because yes, the threshold is whatever the degree temperature was, I forget. But common sense would say, hold on a second, that is a generic threshold applied for the population at large. But we're not dealing with the population at large. In this specific case, we have a nurse who was absolutely definitively exposed to Ebola, who treated a patient who was absolutely infected with Ebola, later died. This was Thomas Duncan in 2014 or 15, I believe. In any case, so that's what I get at when I say the checklist logic of outsourcing your thinking is this almost managerial control to sort of manage that uncertainty. The problem is it results in those people applying the checklist to effectively stop thinking and blindly do what the checklist asks. So there's lots of positives that come with checklists, right? Checklists have improved aviation, have reduced surgical errors, etc. But there's also this downside of allowing people to stop thinking.
Right. Thanks for sharing that. I feel like those are a lot of the examples that have come through as this sort of idea of the blind obedience. And I like that term, which I guess is probably a sad thing in and of itself that there seems to be a lot of that. But you had another one around like using the car mechanic as an example. I thought that was a good one because that's something that I think we can all relate to, is that it's sort of like you kind of see it being set up from far away, is that you take your car in for service and then you get a call and then they are sort of saying, well, okay, let's tell you about a problem that you didn't know you had, and then let's immediately come up with the solution, but let's extract what we want from you, which could be money, but then let's also put under a time pressure to get the outcome that we want, which is you to agree to that. Is that kind of like, along a similar lens of that blind obedience?
Well, so we can come back to that example. That's a little bit of the information asymmetry that you would have and a mechanic would have also, right? And so that may be related, but slightly different. But I do think your point about the blind obedience is an important one, Nabil. And let's go back. I didn't answer your question about COVID, but let's just think about the rule that's in place to wear masks. Now, that's logical. The rationale is very sound. However, what if you were walking on a beach in southern Maine and there were no human beings for hundreds and hundreds of yards in every direction? Do you need to wear a mask? I saw a picture recently of a woman wearing a mask on a beach where there was nobody near her for hundreds of yards. Okay, so now we're blindly following without thinking about the logic. Whereas you can also find examples where people are in crowded groups in a restaurant, etc., or at an event where there's lots of people. I think I saw one recently where it was, I think, a funeral, where some people didn't have masks and they were right next to each other. So the spirit and rationale, there's an obligation on those forming these rules, the experts, et cetera, to provide some context for those of us following these rules so we understand. And then there's this obligation for us to think for ourselves and to understand where the rules apply and where they may not apply. But it really is, at some level, a little bit about common sense and not blindly following, but instead following when the context lines up with the concern.
Great. Thank you. And on that note, we're going to take a short break for some quick announcements and be back in just a minute to continue this fascinating conversation with Vikram Mansharamani on the book, Think for Yourself, Restoring Common Sense in an Age of Experts and Artificial Intelligence.
Can you, your team, or your company benefit from insights such as the ones provided in this podcast? They are immediately available when you join the Conference Board, a membership-based think tank that delivers trusted insights for what's ahead. Reaching across industries and geographies, we bring together our noted experts, senior executives from the world's largest companies, and nonpartisan practical research to help you address your most important business issues. Our membership packages are tailored to your organization's unique needs and budget. To learn more about our offerings, go to www.conferenceboard.org and click Join on the top bar to connect with one of our product specialists.
Hello and welcome back to our conversation with Vikram Mansharamani on the book, Think for Yourself, Restoring Common Sense in an Age of Experts. We had a good first half of our conversation, and let's get back into it. And one of the things in the second half of your book, Vikram, I believe it was in part 3 around reclaiming autonomy. You talked about this idea of like a first principles, which I feel like is a version of thinking for yourself, but then also like this sort of blank sheet theory. And it reminds me of, I had a conversation with someone recently where you had maybe a couple of stories in your book around this, where it's almost when someone is looking to hire someone, is they're almost looking for them to not think they know everything or not have too much experience because they may be quote unquote tainted by that, and it may provide some tunnel vision or so there. Could you just talk a little bit more about what you meant in the book around when you had discussed first principles as well as this idea of blank sheet?
Sure. So one of the examples I use in the book, Nabil, is with David Swenson, the celebrated endowment manager of the Yale University Investment Office. And, he came to that job and didn't have any background in asset management. He'd spent some time as a PhD student at Yale. He'd spent some time on Wall Street. In fact, was responsible for structuring one of the first swaps in the history of the derivatives market. But he hadn't managed money. He hadn't managed a large portfolio. And he came to Yale and he did what very few people would do. He decided to go back to first principles. Most people would enter a job and say, okay, where do we stand? What are the best practices? Meaning go look and see what other people are doing. Instead, what Mr. Swenson did was he said, well, we have a long-term pool of assets that can afford illiquidity. We have a tax advantage status. Therefore, we can be in illiquid securities that may have the opportunity for outsized returns. And he did something that was highly atraditional at the time, very innovative. And the only reason not only, but one of the reasons he was able to come up with that was a reversion to these first principles, which is, what is the situation we're in? What is our objective? How can we match those two things up? Rather than looking at what has conventionally been done. And so that ties very nicely, I think, Nabil, to the other point of your question, which was, in hiring people, understanding the sort of history people come with. Sometimes that history is baggage. It's a way of thinking, right? So if you hire someone from an investment bank, more often than not, if they were involved in, let's say, a mergers and acquisitions department or something like that, they're probably very transactional oriented. That's been the nature of their analysis and experience. Now, bring them into another role where they're supposed to be relationship oriented in the long run. Not saying it's not possible, but there is some baggage. There's some history. There's some skills that have been developed to maximize their performance and their success in one environment, which may not be immediately transferable to that next environment. And likewise, it also has to do with mindset and thinking process, right? What ends up happening is with time and experience, we start to believe we know what we know and maybe have an appreciation for what we don't know. What we often lack is, over time and with experience, we start to minimize the thinking about the assumptions that are underlying some of our own conclusions. We don't have those beginner's eyes, so to say. That comes with experience. That's not necessarily a completely bad thing, but it prevents perhaps in some situations, creativity or innovation. And so what I've suggested is that we not sort of ding people, if you will, for coming with fresh eyes. Sometimes it's people in totally adjacent domains or totally disparate backgrounds that come with the most interesting insights. In fact, one of the really fascinating stories that I came up with in the course of the research for this book that I did include in the book was of this financial advisor who happened to have a little interest in archaeology and ancient Greek archaeology and ancient Egyptian archaeology, etc. And he did some research and he was like, there's this hidden city that got lost off the coast of Alexandria, and no one's been able to find it for thousands of years. And so he took his mathematical mind and his self-taught interest in underwater archaeology, and he literally came up with a discovery that has been hailed as perhaps the most profound archaeological discovery in 1,000 years. I mean, it's stunning. Discovered a city underground. He wasn't an archaeologist. He for sure wasn't an underwater archaeologist. He came with a mathematical and financial background and systematically applied a fresh set of eyes to a intractable problem and came up with a unique way to address it and came up with a world-changing discovery. And so that's what I mean by sort of the fresh eyes experience. Not that experience is bad, but sometimes coming without experience can be good.
Great. Thank you for that. Very helpful. And what I'm taking away from that is perhaps there's a future for me in other careers as well if my options fail. So.
Well, Nabil, you laugh at it. We laugh at it, but it's actually true. I think what it means is that we shouldn't limit ourselves based on our experience or even what our thought skills are, right? We may think we are skilled in a particular domain, but there's no reason that the experiences you have couldn't be really interestingly applied in a totally disparate domain. And that actually gets to a major message I think I try to convey in the book here, which is, sometimes it's better to be a generalist rather than a specialist. Mm-hmm. We've come to really prize specialists. and experts, et cetera. But what we fail to remember is that broad and deep specialization, that deep focus of expertise is equivalent to a broad ignoring, right? I mean, narrow, deep expertise, that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is broad ignoring. And so what we fail to sometimes acknowledge is this deep, narrow expertise helps us lose track of the context, and sometimes the values in the context and the connections rather than the silos of expertise. So, I think that's another way to frame the same thing, which is our careers can be thought of not only as sort of corporate ladders that we're seeking to climb, but we can also start thinking about them as jungle gyms where there may be lateral moves that are productive and maybe, in fact, going backwards, going down a rung on the ladder, then over 3, then up 5, then left 2. It doesn't need to be linear in the way we've historically thought of them, because ultimately developing that generalist skill set may help you be a better leader.
Thank you for that. And so speaking of one, kind of on a similar thread to what you've been talking about over the past few minutes is this idea, and you touch upon this in your book, is the idea of the devil's advocate. And in addition to actually learning the story behind the term, which you discussed in the book, so that was great. I had never known that, is I feel like there's a lot of this happening kind of in society today where we tend to avoid people who may have a disagreement with us or an alternative viewpoint, and we try to seek out others who agree with everything that we say. And so the reason why I bring this up is I feel like here's an opportunity for us to, as individuals to be able to be okay to disagree, but also see things in an alternate viewpoint. Can you talk a little bit more about what the points that you were really looking to get across by talking about the devil's advocate, et cetera, there?
Yeah, Nabil, thanks for the question. It's actually a very important question, particularly given where we are in this political, highly polarized society we find ourselves in today. So I guess what I'm getting at is we should seek out disagreement rather than sort of subject ourselves to the confirmation bias of finding people who agree with us and sort of living in our little filter bubble or echo chambers. I think there's huge value in seeking out disagreement. In fact, one of the things I quote, which I think is fabulous, a great story and captures the essence of it, was Alfred Sloan, the longtime chairman of General Motors, had a meeting and there was a tough decision to be made. And he ends up going into the boardroom or in his group of managers, and he looks around and it looks like they're all agreeing. And so he says, and I'm going to quote it directly from the book, "Gentlemen, I take it we are all in complete agreement on the decision here." He looks around and he sees everyone's head sort of nodding affirmatively. And he goes on. He says, quote, "Then I propose we postpone further discussion on this matter to give ourselves time to develop disagreement and perhaps gain some understanding of what the decision is all about." And I love that quote because it actually captures the essence of what I'm getting at, which is the tough decisions have pros and cons. And if we find ourselves with an obvious answer, it may in fact be that we haven't sought the disagreement to get the nuance, to get to that middle ground where judgment is necessary, where seeing both perspectives is actually valuable. One of the things I say is every perspective is biased, incomplete, and limited. So try to develop multiple perspectives on every problem and decision that you take. And so the devil's advocate fits in that context, right? Which is sometimes it's politically charged, particularly in corporate boardrooms, particularly in management teams, to have someone disagree with the team. Oh, that person's not playing nice, if you will. So why not just give someone that role? Make it structural. And that devil's advocate, their job can be to disagree with what the group comes up with and to give them the resources, time, energy, and support to fully develop an argument. I've played that role with several boardrooms where I've helped them, where I've been the devil's advocate coming up with the opposite perspective, where the boards effectively agreed we're going in one direction. And they say, okay, we're going to take 1 week before we go in that direction and let Vikram really spend some time getting up to speed on where this could be the wrong decision and then present it to us. And so I've done that a couple of times, and I find boards find that useful. And in fact, it may not change their course of action, but it gives them more conviction. It helps them understand the outline of the decision a little better.
That makes sense to me. And Maybe a follow-up last question before we get to the fun portion of our segment is, who do you think the devil's advocate is for your book, and who is maybe arguing perhaps against some of these, and not necessarily a person, but like what are some of those arguments? And
Yeah.
I imagine one would be maybe, we should double down on expertise and specialization as opposed to generalists. But I'd be curious, through the course of your research and conversations on the book, like how did that come up?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Nabil. It's a great question. And here's why. A lot of times the title misleads people into thinking that I'm really suggesting we avoid experts and that we think for ourselves. Thinking for yourself, as sort of the way I think about it, is not about dismissing experts, but it's also not about deferring blindly to them. There's a middle ground, one that I suggest we take, which is to keep experts on tap, but not on top. And that, I think, captures what I'm suggesting the logic of think for yourself is. But that may not be, the devil's advocate logic here is, well, Vikram, that's great. But the reality is it takes a lot of effort for me to make a decision and to optimize every decision and thinking about everything. Why can't I just outsource? More often than not, I'm right. And so my answer to that is, yeah, that's true. Just do it mindfully. Actually, if you're choosing to blindly outsource your thinking to either an expert or a technology, that's fine. Just make sure you know you're doing it. And so the mere fact that you're asking the question in the way you are, Nabil, indicates that you're more aware and mindful about the concern than sort of not being aware of it. So my point is to increase awareness and mindfulness on this outsourcing of thinking and sort of a reclaiming of that thinking. Doesn't mean you can't outsource to experts. Thinking for yourself may be that I choose to outsource my thinking to that expert. In fact, I know we're going to be running out of time here, but I'm going to just read what I think is something fun that's come up in the book multiple times. But the preface of my book, I end it with this paragraph, and it's very short, so I'll read it quickly. It says, I hope this book helps you understand and avoid many of the troubles I've encountered when experts and technologies hijacked my thinking. It is filled with strategies and guidance to help you reclaim control. And this is the last sentence, I think, or this next sentence is what I think the audience will appreciate. One prescription is to question the advice you are being offered. And ironically, that's equally true for this book. So whether you agree with my thinking or not, I hope this book helps you think for yourself. Exactly your point, right? What if I think for myself and I don't want to listen to you, Vikram? So there you go.
Well, I guess if they don't want to listen to you, then they probably wouldn't have clicked on this anyway. So we'll take it for what it's worth. And so
there you go.
I really love the title, and I feel like this is something that just in general, like this is probably the one big skill that everyone should continually and continue to keep working on and have. It's that ability to think for yourself. So thanks for that. And maybe for maybe one or two quick fun questions is saw a lot in your book talking about your travels. What state in the United States have you yet to visit that's on your list?
Interesting. I have not been to North Dakota.
Oh, really? Neither have I.
Nope. I've been to, I think, almost every other state at this point.
Oh,
having recently just been to Idaho and South Dakota and Montana right before the pandemic started. So
there you go.
Yeah.
And speaking of there, you had and this will be our last question, then we'll wrap up, is you talked about a trip that you made to Omaha, and then you tore off some tags off some cowboy boots. Tell us more about those cowboy boots. I'm from Oklahoma, so I'm always interested when I hear cowboy boot stories.
Sure. So I had the real joy of getting to know a bunch of cattlemen in Omaha, the Timmerman family, and a bunch of the folks that are involved in the cattle business that they were associated with. And, so here's this city slicker, Vikram, coming from Boston out to my first trip out to Omaha. This would have been in 2011 or 12. And I was going to see a feed yard. I was going to see the cattle. And I said, well, if I'm going to show up, I don't want to show up in loafers here. I got to get some boots. So I stopped by a Western store on my way out to the feed yard and bought some Justins, I think they were, the first pair, took off the tags in the parking lot and sort of went out there. And, of course, they looked at me and sort of laughed a little bit because they may have even been in loafers themselves at that point. But it was a fun experience. And a story I do share. In fact, the Timmermans are an amazing family. And in fact, I even invited Jim and Gerald Timmerman, the two of the brothers in that business, to come to my class at Harvard. And, amazing how they learn. They're a great example of how learning always can lead to some really interesting successes.
Great. Well, thank you for that. I look forward to seeing a picture of those boots one day. Hopefully you still have them. So
I do.
Well, very nice. And that that concludes our episode. And if you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to our off-the-shelf book discussion podcast series, or explore the entire catalog of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting tcb.org/podcasts.
This has been Off the Shelf, a podcast by the Conference Board.